in this process, I'll wear gloves and not wear gloves. In general, especially for what I'm about to do, I highly recommend gloves. Because there's gonna be some chemicals, and I'm gonna talk through, there's like different chemicals. Some are more toxic, some are less toxic. You know, there's a wide range of things that you can use as substitutes for different things. In the studio, you'll have access to all of them, and so it's just up to you what you want to use. The very first thing we want to do is to bevel the edges of our plates, especially those plates. Well, actually, all of them. When they come, they have a rough edge. You know, they're like just been cut or whatever, and they're sharp. The edges are sharp. They can cut your paper. So if you're running through the press, like those edges can cut your paper. They can cut the blankets, and so it's just good practice to prepare your edges. I normally do this over a trash can, and I think I will actually move the trash can closer. It's not totally necessary, but there will be little copper filings and things, and so it's good to just, you don't want to get them in your shoes and stuff. So, I left my tools behind you, Neiman, so I'm gonna sorry. Okay. There's a few different tools. First is a file. These files, there's a lot of them. They're in that black cabinet by the sink area where a lot of these tools are being stored. So what you want is, you know, about a 45 to 30 degree angle. It doesn't have to be super specific. If you look on old prints, like old etchings or dry points or engravings, sometimes they have these like massive bevels that you can see, like they imprint into the paper. And so if you get really into it, you can make massive bevels. With the file, I'm gonna keep it at that angle, whatever angle I want. And I'm just gonna go in one direction, keeping it so along the edge. I'm holding the plate with my hand, holding the file with the other hand, and just kind of going until, and you can see that it's kind of getting shiny, until I feel like that burr has been knocked down. I can wipe those little shavings off, and I'm just going to do that on each side. So it doesn't take too long. If we were etching, which we're not, but if we were etching, I would have you do this after we etched, because when you etch, it really like eats away at the edges. And so you'd have to do it again anyway. But we're not dealing with acid. Okay. So for the next part, once you do that, then you have this nice filed edge, and it's nice, but it still has a little bit of sharpness to it. And so there's a few ways that you can just polish that edge, basically. The more traditional way is to use the scraper, and I'll show you more about the scraper for other parts of the process. The one thing I want to say about the scraper is it's got 3 edges. They're all really, really sharp. I know somebody who accidentally grabbed it like this and just like sliced through her hand. It was really awful. So I just want to have you keep that in mind. Just be mindful of all the edges. That's also why some of them have this wrapping, because you want to hold it further down, but then the blade is kind of like all over. So again, always just being aware. So what I'm going to do is hold it this way and then put one finger on a flat edge, because what we're using is this pointy sharp edge. And to do that, you just, again, this will just scrape. If we wanted to correct something later, like in your image, if you just like, I don't like this, you can use this to scrape out the surface, to really like scrape parts of the image out. We can go over that later. That's not the best demo for that. This is just to just scrape down some of those extra little things that might be sticking up after we filed. Doesn't have to be too exact. And then the next one is the burnisher. The burnisher is also a tool that we can use to make corrections on the surface of our plate later in the process. But again, it just polishes. Sometimes you can put a tiny dab of oil, like motor oil, to just have that be smooth. But for this purpose, just giving a little pressure polishes that edge. So at each stage, this edge feels a little different. Meaning, first it was like a straight, jagged edge, then I filed it, then it's a beveled edge, which has just like a little bit of extra noise, burr on it. Then you scrape it, and it feels almost the same as this, but this just polishes that edge so it's really smooth. If you need to, you can always like file the corners a little bit, you know, if they have something sticking out. That works. So that's that. This is another tool that you can use somewhat in place of these two. It's a deburring tool. It's kind of fun to use, actually. It's got this like swiveling blade thing, and so you put it along the edge, and what it does is, actually I got a good one here, it makes these copper curlicues if you do it properly. So it's just like slicing a little bit of copper off the edge, which is also kind of fun. Put that there. Okay, so now my plate, the edges are ready, they're safe for the press. And then the next thing I want to do is to polish and then degrease the surface of this plate. So that's what I did with this one. So we put our handprints on it, which is fine. But this one was like super shiny after being a lot more like these other ones. So there's a lot of ways to do this. I'll show you a few. For the polishing, here in the studio we have this Putz pomade. Putz. And it has other functions, but it works as a polisher. Other things you can use are Brasso, like a brass polisher, like any kind of metal polishing thing. The other one that we have, which is stored over in the cleaning, like by the sink, is Barkeeper's Friend, which I really like. This is really great for your pots and pans, just. And so I'll use the Putz pomade because that's what I already started using, but any of those things would work, or again, like any kind of metal cleaning thing would work. So just take some on a clean rag. And for this, I actually did take from the clean rag pile instead of like the semi-dirty rag pile, because I am trying to clean the surface. So, you know, when I'm cleaning up at the end of the day, I'll take from the semi-dirty rag pile. But you can see I'm just doing a swirling motion. This plate's actually not as dirty as some of the other ones, but you can see it went from like a red to like a brown. My other plate was really dirty and it went to more like a black as it was polishing off the dirt. There's these other spots here that I'm going to work a little bit, like specific spots that have rust. It's an old plate. But that's the really cool thing, again, to just keep emphasizing it about the copper plates, is that they have a long life in terms of, you know, if you want to print them, like the same image, but also if you ever want to use the back. I've been keeping my copper plates ever since undergrad, and that's what a lot of these are actually. Plates that I messed up and now will give new life. I don't know what that is. Oh, that's open fit. Okay, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that out unless I use a scraper. And that doesn't matter, it's fine. Okay, so, but now I have this plate that's covered in greasy, gross stuff. And when we print our dry points, we really want the surface of the plate to not have any grease on it. Actually, it's a kind of a good example. This plate I printed right before class, and I was rushing and I didn't degrease it, and it's a plate that I haven't printed in years, and so it just has buildup of stuff, and so the ink stuck to a lot of places where I didn't want it to stick, and in order for me to get it out properly, I would have like over wiped it and like kind of lost a lot of the image. And so the print actually has even more noise than I would otherwise. So it's just a good reminder, take the time to degrease the plate before you print. By the way, this is stored in that cabinet, in the one over there, and all of this other stuff except for the barkeeper's friend is stored over there as well. Okay, so the next thing to degrease, again, there's a lot of ways you can do it. Sort of the most toxic way that I was taught, which we'll show you now, is to use whiting, which is just calcium carbonate, and we use it in a lot of different parts of the printing process. And what the whiting does is it adds a little bit of like a grit, a little bit of tooth to helping really get into that surface and clean it. And then there's this 50-50 mixture of water and ammonia. Ammonia, don't mix with bleach, it's really not great. But this is one thing that you can use. You can also use, with the whiting, you can also use denatured alcohol, which we also have here. This is pretty close to empty, so I'm not going to use it today, but this will fill it up and there'll be more. So you can also use whiting and denatured alcohol. If you don't want to use any of those things, you can also just use detergent, like a dish detergent. And dish detergent is designed for degreasing, right? So that's another option that also works. What you want is to do this process. So I'm just going to sprayed a little bit more than I needed there. Spray some of my ammonia and it's going to start to smell. But you can see as I do this, well, it's not doing exactly what I wanted, but ultimately what I'm going to do is, and I'm wearing gloves for this process. These gloves are greasy, but I don't want to get the oil from my hands back on the surface of the plate because that defeats the purpose of the degreasing. But what I want to do is keep doing the degreasing process until when I run this plate under water, and this is a little hard to describe, it'll be a little hard to capture on video, but I'll just explain it. What you don't want is for it to bead up. You don't want the water to like sit on the surface and form little beads. You want it to be a sheet, like a sheet of water that just flows over the whole surface. And then you'll know that it's really clean. I'm gonna do this one more time.
Is there a way to utilize the remaining grease or to like intentionally grease your plate and use that in a process?
Well, that's a good question here. I'm gonna do the denatured alcohol so you can kind of see that too. I feel like especially at first in this process, like there can be ways to do that in like an etching or something to really, and certainly in like a monoprint, which we'll see, we might get to this semester, we'll see. There are ways that you can do that, but especially at first when you're learning how to print the dry points, it might just make it really frustrating because you'll end up having ink that sticks where you don't want it to. And so the first thing that we're going to focus on is figuring out how to print so that we know what information is on the plate. Like that's the first thing, because sometimes you might print it and say like, oh, like this just like isn't what I thought it was going to be or whatever. And sometimes that might be true. It might be because of the way you inscribed it, but sometimes it could be because either like the ink wasn't the right consistency or the plate wasn't prepared right for printing, or also pretty commonly there wasn't enough pressure or there was too much pressure. You know, like there's all these other factors. And so that's what we're going to start working on, is like putting our plate together, figuring out how to print it so that we get the right, or we know what information is on it. I'm going to do this one more time. And then So that way when we're making a change, it's based on like what we know is there, not that there was some like something else that's distracting us. Okay, I'm gonna rinse this off. Can you guys pause the videos or does it work? I'll be right back. I'm gonna see. Actually, I'll try to rinse it here. It's not perfect, but we're gonna go with it. Then once you do rinse it off, and I can quick prepare this, you want to dry it with newsprint, or that's like an easy way that you're going to dry it without introducing any like dirt to it. So I'm just going to take a newsprint, and you don't want the water to sit on the surface too long because again then that will like introduce the potential for rust. But you can just blot it off with newsprint. And we should be good to go. Okay, so this print probably won't be that exciting, but that's good because that's what we're gonna start with. Okay, how are we doing? Any questions? Any other questions? You'll see that while I was doing that, I put this on newsprint. That just makes the cleanup everything easier at the end. And so, not that you have to, I mean these surfaces are pretty easy to clean too, but this can be a good way to just kind of keep things clean. Okay, so now I'm gonna move on to inking. So we prepare the edge of our plates, we degrease the surface, I put some image stuff on here, and now we're gonna ink. So I already have some ink here that I was using. And I do want to encourage everyone for next week to bring in Tupperwares. They don't have to be exactly like this, but kind of like this. This is what we're going to use to distribute ink to you so that you can have ink at home in the event that we end up at home. So I just want to put that PSA out there. And I'm gonna take ink from here because it'll be easier. Oops, oops, oops. But whenever we are taking ink, fresh ink out of a can, and normally the cans look more like this. This is transparent base, which I'll talk about in a second. But whenever we're taking ink out of a can, we want to try to keep our spatula as parallel to the surface of that ink as possible. So that way, you'll see signs around say don't gouge the ink. What we don't want to do is use this like a spoon and stab it down into the middle and pull some of it up and then put it down because, and you'll see this on the cans too, the ink forms a film after it's been sitting for a while. It's oil-based. When air gets introduced, that top surface dries out a little bit and it forms this like thick film. And if we stab down into it, then it's gonna form that film like in this like convoluted, jagged form, which is kind of like a sculpture, but it's not really what we want. And so then when you're going to get ink and the ink does have that surface film, it's fine, but you just kind of want to remove that skin or part of that skin and pull it back and pull ink out from underneath it. But if there is this like jagged whole thing in there, then you're kind of stuck. You end up wasting a lot of ink. You have to kind of take out the whole thing that touches that skin and try to scrape off what you can and then throw the rest away. And so to preserve and not waste as much as possible, we want to keep our ink parallel. If it's a new can, which I'm sort of cheating because this is ink that I put in here. When it's a new can, it's really easy because the surface is just like that. But anyway, just keep that in mind. I'm sure if you've all taken printing before, you've had that conversation before. So the next thing I'm gonna do is warm up the ink. And that's literally just moving it back and forth because it's oil, and oil, you know, when it's moving or when it's warmer, it's gonna be smoother and want to move. And so the whole next part of this process is about moving ink across the surface and getting it where you want it to go, which is to reveal your image. So how do you know when your ink is ready? You can sort of see how tacky an ink is by dabbing down and see like how far it stretches. You kind of want it to have that long, see how it's like staying attached to the palette knife? It's just really fun. It's staying attached to the palette knife for a while before it breaks. That means that it has good, oh my goodness, I'm gonna forget the word. Stretchiness, which isn't the word that I'm looking for.
Elasticity.
Thank you, elasticity. That's what we want for this process. If it doesn't, or if you feel like you want it to be even looser, there's a few different ways you can modify it. You can add burnt plate oil, which is basically what's mixed into the pigment. So this is like a carbon black pigment mixed into a burnt plate oil, probably like a slightly slightly thicker burnt plate oil. But so basically by adding more burnt plate oil, you're just adding more of the base that this is into itself. Fun fact that I only learned not that long ago, the reason that we can print oil, like so normally in painting, like in oil painting, you paint on canvas, right? And you use linseed oil, and you have to prepare the canvas with gesso to protect the canvas. And you don't normally paint oil paints on paper because it will just eat away at the surface. The reason that we can use basically the same, I mean, this is not that far removed from oil paint, but the difference is that oil paints are mixed with linseed oil as their base, and linseed oil is very caustic. It will eat through the paper. Burnt plate oil is linseed oil that's been boiled, so that a lot of that caustic material is removed from it in the boiling process, in the heating up process. And so it's a more refined type of linseed oil that then doesn't eat at the paper, which is just kind of cool. So for all of the things I'm going to show you as modifiers, a little bit goes a long way. I'm just going to put a dab out on the surface of the table here. This is not very much ink, and so you don't want to loosen it up too much or too fast if you decide you think it's like too thick. And this ink is like pretty good as it is. I might put a little bit of modifier just to sort of show you how it changes it. Another modifier is Set Swell, and it does a similar thing to the plate oil, but instead of adding more oil to it, it's like a cream. It looks like Crisco. Like it actually just looks like Crisco. And so again, this is like a tiny bit goes a long way. Like if I put all of that into there, it would be way too much. Like a tiny bit of this goes a long way. But it also loosens up the ink. It helps it set, what it's called, sets well, helps it set better, and it changes its consistency. And all of these are gonna be stored in this cabinet, the modifiers. And the last one, which I want us to get into playing around with for different things, is transparent base. And actually, maybe I will just add a little bit of transparent base. Well, no, I'm not going to because we haven't really opened it yet. This has a separate thing on it, and let's do it. Why not? So transparent base, as you can imagine, it's also the thicker. So again, I'm going to carefully just lift up. I took a clean palette knife because we don't want to mix. I certainly don't want to get like black ink into this transparent base, which would ruin it for everyone. But the same is true with like a yellow. you want to make sure that your palette knives are clean before you put them, and I'm saying yellow especially because it's like you'll really ruin an entire can of yellow. So I should have wiped this off before I did that, just to make sure, just to be safe. Okay, so I'm actually just gonna take the transparent base off of here. I know it doesn't look transparent because it's got sort of like a creamy color, but what it does is it makes the ink more transparent. So I wasn't gonna get into all of this today, and we're gonna do a lot more of this next week. Next week is, again, we're gonna be more of a printing day. So if I wanted to make my black into a gray, or what's actually a really cool thing is if you do have some areas in your print that are built up, like really dark, built up with a lot, and you have other areas that are lighter, by adding a little bit of transparency to black, or to any of the colors, but especially to black in this case, it will still print really richly in those really dark areas, but then it's like gonna be even lighter in those lighter areas, so you'll get an even stronger contrast, even if it's just a tiny bit. So, can anyone guess what's the best way for me to mix the black and the transparent base together?
You add a little bit of the black to the transparent.
That's exactly right. And this is gonna be the same for any time that you're mixing a lighter color and a darker color. So if I'm making purple, we use purple as an example, which is made of blue and red.
It's like,
A trick question, it's too easy. I used to teach foundations, and not everyone in the world knows that. You want to mix the blue into the red, and you just want to mix a little bit of blue into the red at a time, because, and I've definitely done this, especially with something like with a yellow, like a green. You can waste a lot of the lighter color trying to make the darker color lighter, and then you end up with like an enormous amount of ink that you don't even want because it's not the color you want. So you always want to mix a little bit of the darker thing into the lighter thing. So I even just took what was on my palette knife to start with, because that wasn't very much transparent base, and I'm also doing something that I shouldn't be doing, which is like spreading my ink all over the place. You'll be much neater. But this also kind of makes it really elastic too. So all of these modifiers in some way loosen the ink a little bit, but they have different functions in doing that, right? So if you don't want to change the tone of the ink, but you want to change the consistency, then I would go with the Setswell or the plate oil. But if you want to make it lighter, even if you don't want to change the consistency, you can use the transparent base. And especially when we get into multi-layered prints, printing one on top of another, adding some transparency can help a lot to then allow those colors to really interact as you print on top of one another. Okay, it's a lot of information. How are we doing? It's making sense? So I just want to show you the one way that you can test your color is by taking a little bit of, I've knocked a lot of this off of my palette knife, but I'm just going to take a tiny bit like that, and I'm going to drag it across a newsprint, or it might be like a sketchbook paper. Newsprint obviously has a little bit of tone to it, so it's not going to be exact. And then I'll wipe that off because I'm not going to use it in the transparent base again. And I'm going to do the same thing with the original non-modified black, so you can kind of see the difference. So you can see that, right? This is with transparent, this is original, unmodified. And so even just that, a little bit, and I'd say this is probably like about 50-50. It's probably about the same amount of transparent base as the black. And so it's cutting it in half. Okay, which one do you want me to use? Why not? And it seems to be a better consistency. Okay, how are we doing? Any questions so far? Okay, so the inking has three phases. First, in each phase we're both kind of spreading and removing ink, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So phase one, and we can either use these little cards, which live over there by the toaster oven. They work fine. I brought a few more over here. They're not my favorite, but they work. And so the thing I don't like about them as much is that they break down pretty easily. And so I feel like that they're fine. The last one that I was printing had a lot of burr, and so it was just like cutting the card. So again, I'm just scooping up a little bit. I want to make sure that there's some ink on the whole edge of whatever I'm using, and then I'm spreading it around. And as I'm spreading it around, and this is especially true with Drypoint, but actually for all the intaglio processes, I'm going from different directions. I'm sort of starting in the middle, working my way out. I'm making this kind of swirling motion, which you don't have to make a swirling motion, but the idea is that you want to get at the lines from different directions. Because it might be that when you were drawing the line, you know, maybe it kind of came from this way, but another one came from this way, and so the burrs are kind of, and actually the burrs get kicked up in different directions. And so the idea is to get ink on all parts of the burr, and just make sure that it's consistent. The other tool, which this is working pretty well for this, as you're doing this, you can hold it in your hand like this, which I'm doing mostly to show you. You can also, have it flat on the surface, which I feel like would be more common. And you know, just kind of turning it, and then as I get to the edge, I'm sort of supporting this with my hand as it sticks over, but I'm just pushing the ink to the edge. You want to make sure you get all of the edges, even if the image, even if you only have something in the center or like only off to one side, you still want to ink up the whole plate, because as you'll see, depending how you wipe it, there might be some plate tone, some like leftover ink that's not as perfect as a non-inked thing, and you don't want there to be like a line between those two places or whatever. So you just want to ink up the whole plate. And then since I know there's like not much information on this side, I'm not going to worry about it too much, but I'm just going to make sure that I get some ink on those edges. And then the next thing you want to do is actually wipe. So each phase of this process is like apply it, but then scrape off or pull off as much as you can. And that's going to be true for the next phase also. So I'm just going to, this matters less, as long as you know that you kind of come in different directions. The direction you scrape the ink off matters a little bit less, but I'm just scraping this back off and putting it in my pile here. Put this back together so that it's not spreading so far. It'll be much neater than me, don't worry. The thing I want you to also feel with printmaking in general is, I know a lot of people, and you've all taken it before, but a lot of people get really bogged down in like the technical, and there is a lot of technical stuff, but what I hope is that it shouldn't be scary. It's just to help us try to communicate our image, and so we can follow these however we want. Okay, so that's the first step of the inking. The next step is tarlataning, and I already have this tarlatan. The roll of tarlatan is over there next to the cabinet, and just for ease's sake, I'm not going to go over and get a new piece. You want to take a piece, so you'll open the roll up, and this may not be how most people do it, and you may feel like it's too much. Maybe it will be a little bit too much, but you want to take a piece that's not a full arm's length, but like close to like an arm's length. This is maybe a little bit bigger than I need, but the other thing is that we're gonna use it consistently and we're gonna use it a bunch. So once you have your piece, the next thing is tarlatan, just so you know, is cheesecloth that's been starched. So it's cheesecloth that has starch on it that makes it a little bit stiffer. But when we first get it, it's a little too stiff. And so the first thing you want to do is, and this I've already done it with this one, so you don't get the great sound that you'll get when you do this, is to just take it on a diagonal and pull it, pull, and then do the same thing going the other way, pull, and that just loosens it up a little bit. So we don't want it as like floppy as cheesecloth, though I have been in print shops that just use cheesecloth. But we also don't want it to like accidentally scrape our plate or whatever. Okay, then this is the hard part. We want to turn this into a weird ball that has a flat front. So what I'm going to do is kind of think of this as my front, and I'm going to turn the back into it. See what I'm doing there? Into it, until I have this like weird ball disc thing. So you want a flat, you don't want to be trying to have a surface like this, because it'll just make it more difficult. You want to have just like one flat face. And the next thing is you want to shove it into your palm so that your palm is like pretty much open. Like you want to try to have your hand open. And we all have different sized hands, so you may realize like that you have too much or too little or whatever. But with a basically open palm, shove it in there so you have this flat face. Got it? Okay. Now, tarlataning, which I don't even really know if it's a verb, but it is right now. You're doing, just like with the putting the ink on, you're doing two things at once. The first part, and there isn't much information on here, if I was doing that plate, it would look a lot different. The first thing you're doing is actually still trying to push ink around all the lines and make sure that it's getting around all the lines. So it's not an immediate like wiping off the surface and like removing everything. So you want to start, in all of these processes, you want to be pretty, like, we'll say medium gentle. It's not like it's like a just wiping, you know, gliding along the surface. So you can see I'm doing this like wrist action swirl thing. Just gliding along the surface. I'm both kind of moving the ink around, and if there were a lot of information here, the first thing it would start to do is like the color, and it's happening here too, it's just a little harder to see. The tone of the ink will change. So it goes from being those like shiny, smooth stripes to being like a sort of like matte ink that's being pushed around, and you can sort of see it there. See how it went from like more shiny, now it's sort of like a matte surface, like before we degreased it. Those lines I made are going to be really subtle, so it's going to be a good printing challenge, and I might have even just wiped it out of there, we'll see. Other things, I'm again like sort of starting from the middle, kind of moving out to the sides. You want to remember, and again, this plate doesn't really have that much information on it, but you want to remember to get the corners. Sometimes if we end up, or it's easier to end up leaving more ink in the corners than not, and then that makes the next phase harder. So I'm going to stop here, which is like a lot of ink is gone. If I had more information on this plate, then that wouldn't have gone quite as fast, and it might have been less clear when to stop. You know, because it's still, you don't want to take too much off in this process, which is why this may not have been the best demo plate. Okay, how are we doing? Making sense? Okay. Now, there's two ways to do the next part. Both are totally fine, and I want you to try both. The one is paper wiping, which is more common, and if you've done this before, I'm sure this is how you would have been taught to do it, which is to take a newsprint, or underneath the table there's also phone books, which is the normal common way to do it, or newspaper or whatever. Newsprint has a really good surface for this process. In both cases, in both of these processes that I'm going to show you, the key is to not be to be gentle. You really are you want to start by just really lightly, we're going to really lightly move across the surface of this plate. So I'm going to use, there's different ways you can do it. I'm going to use 2 fingers, and I'm just kind of like barely, just to start, I'm just barely, if I get to a place like here where there's more ink buildup and I know there's nothing there, then I can be a little bit less gentle. And again, I would normally keep this flat on the surface of the table. But it's very easy, again, especially with Drypoint, it's very easy to overwipe, to like pull the ink out of your lines without realizing. And that can also definitely happen with the tarlatan. So I'm going to do half and half. This half I'm going to paper wipe. As you can see, it builds up, it's pulling ink off the surface. Oops. When it, when you're ready, you can move to a different section. Some people like to use a big sheet of paper and move it all around. I like to use little, just like little things like this that are more hand-sized. And I'll show you, I'm gonna take one section, this section in the middle up here, and I'm gonna over polish it. I'm just gonna really polish it so that there's no plate tone, and we'll see if we can see a difference when we print it. Okay, so that's that half. The other method is called hand wiping. And so for that, I'm gonna take my gloves off. And I'm going to use this stuff, and this is where the pandemic is going to make this a little bit more challenging if we all want to try it. But I'll figure out a way of maybe giving you guys each. This is just my own personal stuff. It's called Skin Safer. It's this non-petroleum based. It's basically like Second Skin. Or, there's lots of other things by that brand. What I normally do is just take some in my fingers, so that I make sure I get it in my fingernails. And I just rub it, especially on my palms. But this basically is like it's not like a glove, but it's kind of like a glove, so that then when I go and wash my hands, the ink is not like embedded in all of my pores. It's really just washes off the surface. This stuff is pretty great. But again, I don't think we should all reach our hands in there, so I'll figure out a system. Maybe I'll just spoon some. You don't need a lot. You can just spoon it out onto the surface of the table. So hand wiping is in some ways the same idea of just pulling ink off the surface of this plate so that it's polished, clean, ready to go, and the ink is only in the lines that we want to print and not anywhere else. And so the goal is to use this part of my palm, this sort of like side edge of my palm, and what I like to do is take a clean rag and just kind of hold it underneath the plate and just wipe from the center out. I know this is a lot for day one, so tell me how you're doing. But this we're gonna practice. We can practice next week. We're gonna keep practicing, but I'll just show you all of it today. Then you can see there's a tiny bit, kind of similar to the amount of ink that built up on my newsprint. As the ink builds up, you can take a little bit of whiting, which I have here on this newsprint, and you don't want to get whiting on your plate. So I'm just gonna, what this does is it just dries out the side of my hand, so that way it still is receptive to another round of ink. Again, super gentle. But we don't want to get whiting all over our plate because it hardens the ink. in the lines, and then it's really hard to clean off. Okay. Basically, since there wasn't that much information, whoops, this isn't doing, neither of this last stage is doing that much because I targeted it off. I'm curious if these lines over here are gonna print, and I think that they might not. Okay, last thing before I print. You always wanna remember to wipe your edges. Because this plate is three-dimensional, even though the third dimension is really narrow. And you'll have ink on those edges, but since we just polished them so well, they'll clean right off. The most embarrassing thing is when you've worked so hard on a plate, and there's a spot where I didn't polish my edge that well, and then you have this like beautiful print, and then on the paper all around it is like a dark square of where you forgot to wipe the edges. It's just a little distracting. And then sometimes I'll just do one last, oops, I'm contaminating which side is paper and hand wiped. Okay, so now I'm ready to print. I'm gonna talk a lot more next week about printing and how to set up the press and how to prepare it. But for now, I have it set up, and we're gonna move over there. I'm gonna grab a newsprint. We'll also talk more about registration systems, so how to make sure that you're printing your image inside your, how you're printing your image like perfectly squared on your paper. We will do all of that next week. But for now, I have this press so that I have the blankets all set up. Oh, and you don't want to do what I just did, which is get ink on a part of the newsprint that then is going to cause it to print on your paper. So you want to have a clean newsprint. You want to place your plate on that newsprint, slide it where you want to go. You want to make sure you have clean hands. Normally I would wash my hands at this stage, but they aren't too dirty. I have paper that I've been soaking in this damp pack, which we'll talk about next week also. You want to make sure that the paper is, you want to soak it so that it's like more receptive to the ink. It releases, it like opens up the sizing. We'll talk more about that next week. But I have some here that we can use today. I'm going to take my paper, folding it corner to corner. And again, normally next week we'll have a really brilliant registration system, which this is not. And then I'm going to have another newsprint on top so that just in case any ink or anything, with my nice clean hands, I'll put the blankets down. And I'm going to roll it through. And here is always the exciting moment of truth. For, in this case, a not that exciting image, but we'll see. Great, so if everybody, this is where, can you gather around? How can you do this? I'll bring this back over to our other station. I'll bring both things back over. Okay. So we can just cycle through. Now let's remember that everything prints backwards, right? So this little mark here is this mark here, and then moving out mirrored. But these are the things that I drew. So up here is the really faint, and it printed. I mean, it printed in a way that's really, really faint. So it made a mark, but it's not gonna be seen that well. That was me like barely touching the surface. Here was my light marks that I built up on top of one another into a cross-hatch mess of different directions. This one I thought I was pressing really hard, and I was, and you can see that better. And then this was the original one that was somewhere in between. I was just like making marks. Now on this plate, we have engraved lines, which are even deeper than etched lines. I mean, they're like really, really deep, so you can see that contrast. And then all kinds of other marks from just like this thing being in a drawer and being carried around. And so I don't even know what some of them are. I think some of it's like rust. This is from acid biting it at a previous time on the back because there was an image on the other side. So anyway, just cycle through and you can take a look at the plate and the image together. All right, and I can conclude the video.